scientific he has made during his long and rich career, mostly at the University of Toronto, and that really has changed the way we think about multilingualism and education. So in a way, we are all very grateful for everything you have done for education, Jim. But what you probably don't know is that it was Jim Cummins who brought the first language-friendly school of Canada to us. One day, I received an email from Roberto, the director of Silver Creek School. He had done a multilingual project years ago with Jim and his team, and wanted to repeat the experience with his whole team. And Jim told him about the language-friendly school, and that's how the first language-friendly school was born in Canada. For those who listened to Kimberly, she is from that school, and Alia is also from that school. Jim, you are again here today because you have supported the network since its very first day. So we are also very grateful for that. This is precious to all of us, every school, every teacher, every student, from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Emmanuel, for that really kind introduction. And let me just thank you and Ellen Rose for the invitation to be here once again. And also let me just thank you for the work that both of you have done in literally putting language-friendly schools on the map. The title of the project, Language-Friendly Schools, is absolutely brilliant. The idea is not necessarily new. People have been talking about how to integrate students' home languages into the classroom for quite a number of years, but putting a name on it, like language-friendly schools, and focusing on the entire school, I think changes the conception of how we think about what's possible. And the reality is that very few educators want to be part of what would be a language-unfriendly school, and yet that's the reality for many educators who have not really thought through the issues, and policymakers who just assume that, well, it's natural that only the major societal language would be the language of schooling. And what you and Ellen Rose and your colleagues have done is to change the discourse about these issues. And I think that's an amazing contribution. And I'm really proud and happy to be a small part of this whole project. So let me just share my screen, and I want to pick up on what Emmanuel mentioned in terms of the role of a good friend of mine and somebody I've learned an enormous amount from, Roberto Di Prospero, who you see in the picture there on the title page of my presentation. I've known Rob for many, many years, and he was principal of Thornwood Public School near Toronto when I was able to work with some of the teachers there in terms of looking at issues related to students' identity and language. And when Rob moved to Silver Creek Public School, I had retired, and he contacted Emmanuel about becoming part of the Language Friendly Schools Network. And the article that probably everybody in the room is familiar with, that Emmanuel and Ellen Rose wrote, that was published quite recently in in a journal called Childhood Education, contains a quote from Rob, and I'll just go to that right now. This is what the quote says. It says, Rob grew up in an Italian immigrant household with parents who spoke Italian. And they quote Rob as saying, "I went into school with 2 languages and I left with 1. This is the exact opposite of what education should do. It should add things, not take away things." And when I read that quote from Roberto, it brought back memories to me that I'm going to share with you, because these memories go back more than 40 years. And they had a profound, the experience had a profound impact on the way I thought about languages in schooling. And they relate to a presentation I heard from Mary Ashworth, who is a professor of education in the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She was quite an influential voice during the 1980s, in particular, in Canada. And she brought a very humanistic orientation to thinking about teaching English as an additional language in Canadian schools. You see some of the books that she wrote down in the bottom. Mary passed away a few years ago. She retired from UBC in 1988. And when she passed, I wrote a very short recollection of some of the experiences that I'd had in interacting with Mary. And I'm just going to read this to you. It's a slightly edited version of what I wrote, because what Mary said here, I think, goes right to the key insight that underlies the language-friendly schools movement. My most vivid memory of Mary is of the first time I heard her speak in the late 1970s at a teaching of English as a second language conference in Toronto. She was giving the closing keynote speak at the conference, and it was standing room only. Being one of the laggards, I was standing by the wall, but close enough to the podium to sense the enormous charisma that Mary conveyed. There was perfect harmony between the elegance of Mary's physical presence and the eloquence of her message. Charm and logic blended into powerful advocacy for students who were learning English as an additional language. She concluded her speech by making the point that many students come to school either already bilingual in their home language in English or in the process of becoming bilingual. However, 12 years later, a large proportion of these students leave school monolingual in English. The very essence of the term education, the nurturing of students' abilities and talents, was negated by the education they received in Canadian schools. For me, this was a startling and disturbing insight and dramatically affected the trajectory of my own academic work. Clearly, in context characterized by racism or other forms of overt discrimination, schools have systematically reinforced the coercive power relations of the wider society. However, Mary was talking about the Canadian education system, which at that time was busy wrapping itself in the cloak of multiculturalism. The idea that Canadian schools and educators could be agents in the reduction of students' potential and the constriction of possibilities, whether inadvertently or intentionally, was really provocative. However, Mary's point was that as educators, we have the power to challenge these discriminatory structures and discourses and expand rather than constrict students' identity options. The title of her book, Blessed with Bilingual Brains, expressed this point very clearly. Mary as a person embodied the spiritual force of what teaching English as an additional language is all about. It expands the human potential of both teacher and student and increases the eloquence and elegance of the society they form. So what Mary, I think, was talking about here can be encapsulated by thinking about what is the image of the student that we're sketching in our instruction. And like, if we were to take a bird's eye view and look down at all of the interactions that are going on in a school, to what extent do these interactions communicate to students that they're capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate? Obviously, in Roberto Di Prospero's case and many, many other students in Canadian schools, in American schools, and European schools, the message that they have got has been that their home language should be left at the schoolhouse door. It doesn't belong in the school. If they want to be Canadian or Dutch or be a legitimate part of the society, they have to give up their home language. And in some cases, this message was reinforced with brutality. More often, currently, it's just not made explicit, but the message that students get is that they should leave their languages at the schoolhouse door. Are students, multilingual students who are learning the language of instruction, capable of higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments? if the mindset amongst educators in the school is that, well, first of all, students have to learn the school language, and then they can do higher order thinking and inquiry and creative work. Are students getting the message that they're capable of creative and imaginative thinking, capable of creating literature and art, capable of generating new knowledge, capable of thinking about and finding solutions to social issues? So all of the interactions that are occurring within the school context are communicating messages around these issues. And too often in the past and still in the present, the message that students who are learning the school language get is a deficit message, that they are defined by what they lack. They're called English as a second language students, or Dutch as a second language students, or Dutch language learners, or some other label that focuses in on what they lack rather than what they bring to the school. And what's good to see is that the term multilingual or plurilingual is increasingly being used to describe students who are learning the school language, but who also have access to at least one and often several other languages. And so when we look at Mary Ashworth's point and what Roberto Di Prospero said in terms of their experience of, or his experience of, internalizing the message that only English was important in the school context and gradually losing much of his fluency in the language of his home. This is a message that diminishes students. It's a message that the whole language-friendly school movement is designed to refute and eradicate. Let me just give you a concrete example. I'd like to kind of share with you the voices of some of the students that I've been fortunate to listen to and work with over the last 20 years. One of the studies that I was involved in about 15 years ago with my colleague and good friend, Margaret Early from the University of British Columbia, was a cross-Canada project where we looked at what teachers could do. We worked with teachers to explore what happens when teachers try and bring in students' languages into the classroom, and when they focus in on using multimodal approaches to teaching, not just linear text-based approaches. And this is from a school, an elementary school, primary school in the Toronto area, where the teacher was one of the teachers involved in the project, and she opened up the classroom space to talk to her grade 4 students about her own language learning experiences. She'd grown up in India. She spoke about 6 different languages, and she talked to them about her experience and got them talking about their experiences of learning languages. And gradually students got into writing about their languages, exploring languages, writing dual language books, and doing a lot of other really powerful things. But this is the recollection of one of the students in that class. She was a student from Hong Kong, and Cantonese was her home language. And she recalled how she said she's not always comfortable speaking Cantonese when I have to go to the office for some reason. I don't like it because a lot of teachers are at the office and I don't like speaking in front of them. I know that they're listening to me. I get nervous and afraid. For example, once I didn't feel very well in grade 1. So my teacher took me to the office to call my grandma. My grandma can't speak English, and she also can't hear very well. So I had to speak in Cantonese very loudly for her to hear. So when I spoke to my grandma, I felt very nervous. Sorry. She goes on to say that because she knew that the teachers were going to hear her. And what is highlighted here is the fact that this child has internalized a message that was probably never made explicit. This was a school that prided itself on being highly multicultural. They recognized the cultures and languages that students brought into school, but they didn't do anything very specific up to this point about the language issues. You could walk through the school and see nothing but English on the walls. And so students pick up the idea that the only legitimate language in the school is the major school language, and they have to hide the fact that they are speakers of multiple languages. If we look at what happens when teachers adopt a different orientation, when they become proactive in encouraging students to use their languages and build on their language knowledge to learn the school language. I'll give you a couple of examples from the same project and what this approach communicates to students about who they are and who they can become. The examples I'm going to share with you come from classes taught by one of the most innovative and creative teachers I've had the privilege to know and to work with, a person called Lisa Leone. And Lisa encouraged her students to, when they were doing projects such as writing, to use their first language. And this is an example where 3 students who had come from Pakistan wrote a dual language book in Urdu and English. It was called The New Country. They were in, Lisa was teaching a unit on immigration, and this was a culminating or final project that the students were doing. And they could choose to do whatever they wanted, as long as it focused in on the topic. And these 3 students, Madiha, Sulmana, and Kanta, proposed to the teacher that they write a story about their experiences of coming to Canada. They were coming to high-rise Canada from rural Pakistan. And Sulmana and Kanta had been in Canada about 3.5 years, and their English was pretty fluent. Madiha had just arrived about 6 weeks before they started this project, and her English was very elementary. She was in the beginning phases of acquiring English. So they wrote this story initially in Urdu, initially in English, and they discussed what they were going to write about in Urdu. They discussed what was going to be on each page. They planned it out, and Madiha was a full participant in that. If they were confined to English in the classroom, she couldn't have participated. They wrote a 20-page story, beautifully illustrated, that's been read by thousands of people because it's been up on the web. Now, if Madiha had been in a regular, more typical class in Canada or elsewhere, where only English was the legitimate language, and if she were asked to write a culminating project or write something in English, you might have got 1 or 2 painful sentences out of her because she just didn't have the language. But when the space was opened up, she became the very proud author with her 2 friends of a book that has been recognized and read by many, many thousands of people. Here's what Kanta said about this project. Lisa, the teacher, and several of her students presented at a English as a Second Language conference in Toronto a couple of years after this project was carried out. And here's what Kanta said about this project. She said, "How it helped me was when I came here in grade 4, the teachers didn't know what I was capable of. I was given a pack of crayons and a coloring book and told to get on coloring with it. And after I felt so bad about that, I'm capable of doing much more than just that. I have my own inner skills to show the world other than just coloring. And I felt that those skills of mine are important also. So when we started writing the book, I could actually show the world that I am something instead of just coloring." So they were in grade 7 when they wrote this, so about 13 years old. And that's how it helped me. And it made me so proud of myself that I'm actually capable of doing something. And here today at the conference, I am actually doing something. I'm not just a coloring person. I can show you that I am something. I think you see clearly here the central role of identity in everything that happens in schools. And so when we look at the normal process of schooling that is conducted only through the dominant language, this is negating or asking students to negate a major part of who they are and to split it off from what happens in school. Another example comes from Tomer. This was a grade 6 class. And Tomer had come from Israel. He was in his first year of learning English. He'd grown up in an agricultural context and was very passionate about horses. And so when they were doing a writing project, the teacher wanted to make sure that they were covering all of the same curriculum expectations as in the regular classroom. And so she wanted to make sure that students were writing creatively, which was one of the expectations for grade 6 children in the regular curriculum. And now Tomer was in the early stages of learning English, so he wouldn't have been able to write very much in English by itself at this stage of his learning. But the teacher encouraged him to write initially in Hebrew, and then when he'd written a story, they found there was a teacher in the school who knew enough Hebrew to help him translate from Hebrew into English. And once again, the result is a dual language book that's been up on the web, that's been read by Tomer's friends back in Israel, been read by his parents, been read by people like me in the university, been read by many other students. And here's Tomer's insights about this whole process. I think using your first language is so helpful because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. You don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too. And then it's easier to understand the second language. Here he's talking about the fact that knowledge transfers across languages. I've called this the common underlying proficiency, but I think Tomer's explanation is much clearer than anything I've ever been able to come up with. Tomer goes on to say, it makes it more faster to be able to use both languages instead of just breaking your head to think of the word in English when you already know the word in another language. So it makes it faster and easier to understand. And again, these are insights that I wish all teachers could have. So if we look at Lisa's Leonie's identity as a teacher, some of the comments that she made at the conference, that the video may not work, but I'll give it a try anyway.
My overarching goal as a teacher is to uncover all that is unknown to me about my students, linguistically, culturally, and especially understand the community that they're a part of, because kids come to school with their parents and their family and their faith community, and obviously the list goes on. And so when students enter my class, I want to discover all that is unknown to me, not only about them as learners, but them as people.
Okay, I'm not sure if the audio of that came across, but you can read it there on the left-hand side of the slide. Lisa goes on to say, the way I see it, everything has to relate to the identity of the students. Children have to see themselves in every aspect of their work in school. And obviously, this is one of the major starting points for the language-friendly school movement. And it's highlighted by the experiences of teachers like Lisa, students like Tomer, Mediha, Sulmana, Nkanta, and others. So if we move on from the reality of identity being totally tied in with students' language knowledge, and the fact that in many school contexts, the vast majority of school contexts still, the orientation towards children's languages is one of constricting students' identity, because only English or only the dominant school language is what's recognized in the school. When the teacher opens up the space to become a multilingual space where students' languages are welcomed, we find all kinds of amazing work that can happen. We see this in Silver Creek School. We see it in many of the other schools that are involved in the language-friendly schools movement. But I'd like to finish up by just talking a little bit about what's the bigger picture here. How does the language-friendly school movement fit in with a broader focus on ensuring that all students have opportunities to succeed to their full potential in schools? And so a starting point for looking at this is to ask ourselves, well, who are the groups, or which are the groups that tend to experience disproportionate underachievement? And when we look at the big picture globally, there are three broad groups that are overlapping, but they're conceptually distinct, that tend to experience underachievement. And obviously not everybody from these groups do, but there's a disproportionate number of students from these categories who have difficulties. One of these categories are students from immigrant backgrounds who are learning the school language as a second language. Then there are students who are coming from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. Poverty is a major underlying condition of far too many students around the world. And students from immigrant backgrounds are often in a situation where their parents are struggling to put food on the table. They're living in overcrowded conditions. and the effects of poverty and social disadvantage generally has an impact on how well they do in school. And then there are students from socially marginalized groups that have been subject to racism and various forms of exclusion from educational and social opportunity, often over generations. And we all can identify some of those groups. In the European context, Roma students would be an obvious example. In many contexts around the world, Indigenous students have experienced brutality, discrimination that is ongoing, certainly in countries like Canada. And so there are different causal factors, or what researchers are increasingly calling opportunity gaps, that are predictive of underachievement in each of these contexts. And so putting it all together, this is a framework that I've used in working with schools and with teachers to talk about what kinds of directions schools need to move in order to implement evidence-based instructional responses. And it's not enough just to focus on students who are learning the school language and provide language support. It's not enough even to recognize and engage students' home languages. That's a really important aspect. But there's more that we have to do, because the causes of underachievement are coming also from social disadvantage and also from the marginalized status of racialized groups in the wider society. And there are ways that have been shown through the research that schools can respond to these causes of underachievement. I'm not going to go into detail about it, but you can see at the bottom of the screen the kinds of instructional directions that are implied by the research. And in addition to supporting students' learning of the school language and recognizing their multilingual repertoires, we need to respond to some of the factors that are operating with students who are growing up in poverty. There's not a lot the schools can do directly about things like overcrowding or housing segregation. But one thing we can do a lot in relation to is the fact that many students growing up in low-income backgrounds have far less exposure to print and books and texts in general in their homes, in their neighborhoods, and often in their schools than students from more affluent backgrounds. And there's a huge amount of research out there that shows that print access and literacy engagement are hugely predictive of how well students learn to read. And so one of the things that we need to do in our schools, and we need to talk about as part of our whole school policies, is to ask ourselves how we can maximize print access and literacy engagement. And also, obviously, we need to focus in on language awareness and reinforce students' knowledge of language across the curriculum. And then if we look at students from marginalized communities who've experienced a variety of forms of social discrimination and stigmatization, all of which add up to a process of identity devaluation of communities and identity devaluation of students within the school context through low teacher expectations, through rejection of students' home languages. If identity devaluation is a reinforcer of underachievement, then it's clear that one of the major things that we need to focus on in our schools is how can we affirm students' identities in the context of their academic work. This means connecting instruction to students' lives, decolonizing curriculum and instruction through culturally responsive or culturally sustaining pedagogy, and basically focusing in on how we can affirm the reality of students' identities as legitimate, potentially powerful learners in our school contexts. Let me just give you an example of how one teacher did this. Again, it was in the school that Roberto was principal of a number of years ago. The teacher was a person called Tobin Zikmanis, and he was teaching grade 5 students, so 11-year-old students. And he was teaching a data management course. And rather than following the textbook and going through what the textbook said he should be teaching, he thought, well, we're in a school with 80% of the students coming from non-English speaking backgrounds and multilingual backgrounds. Why don't we use this reality to teach or to learn about how we can manipulate data? So he had his students brainstorm about what they would like to know about the linguistic diversity of the school. He divided students up into small groups. They came up with about three questions, broad questions. And then they did a survey with the help of the teachers. Each group took a different grade level, and they surveyed the languages that students knew. And then they churned out all kinds of pie charts and bar graphs and other ways of manipulating this data. This was an identity project because students were finding out about who we are as a school community, where their knowledge of languages was being highlighted as an intellectual accomplishment. And this is the kind of project that we will come up with when we start thinking in terms of identity, when we start thinking in terms of students' linguistic accomplishments, rather than seeing these as deficits, seeing these as potential stepping stones to powerful uses of language. And so if we go back to Tomer's dual language book and think about all of the instructional strategies that are encapsulated in a project like this, virtually all of the things that are in that broad framework in terms of evidence-based responses are reflected here. Instruction is being scaffolded by engaging students' multilingual repertoires. Tomer learned an enormous amount of English as a result of translating, with the help of the teacher, what he had written in Hebrew into English. His knowledge of academic language was reinforced. His multilingual abilities were engaged by promoting transfer across languages. Literacy engagement was obviously involved here. He was writing, he was becoming an author. This was connected to his lives, and his identity was dramatically affirmed in the process of doing this. So let me just finish there and thank all of you again for the opportunity to be here, even remotely. And let me again finish by congratulating Emmanuel and Ellen Rose for their brilliance in initiating this movement, which I think is going to be a major player in education over the next few decades. So thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I have to say this was such a rich day. We've